All right, after she happened to stumble onto Boaz's field and he treated her so kindly and so generously, Naomi praises Yahweh as the one who's not abandoned His hesed toward the living and the dead. So after that, you have that I think an awakening on Naomi's part where she says that He's not abandoned His hesed toward the living and the dead. And then Naomi, she comes out of this hopelessness. She emerges from this hopelessness, this dark place where she was, her feeling that she was God's enemy and that He would never smile on her again. And you can get that way when things have just gone, you have a series of tragedies in your life. It's easy to start feeling that way. And so that's where she was, and you can understand given the situation that she was in. And then when she sees these things, she has this heart that is renewed now by a hope. You have a spark of hope that God will in fact smile on her, that He will in fact work for her good and blessing. And she realizes the potential that Boaz, who is a kinsman redeemer, the potential that he poses for Ruth and for the survival of Elimelech's and Mahlon's line. So at that, I think that's a significant place in the book there. Now in chapter 2, verse 23, it summarizes what happened after Ruth's encounter with Boaz, after she returns and reports that to Naomi. And it says, Ruth kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This means, so you see that we have this period of time now. She has been there from late April to early June, out in Boaz's field. So we're talking about 6 or 7 weeks. And you don't get any more discussion of interaction between Ruth and Boaz. So here we had this encounter that clearly was providential, and you're waiting and thinking, okay, well, what's going to happen? Well, then just 6, 7 weeks go by and she's just living with Naomi. And you're waiting as a reader saying, well, what's going to come of this? What's going to happen? So that's an important aspect here of the story. In chapter 3, we learn that Naomi has a plan. Now, she's got a plan for encouraging Boaz to assume what she perceives as his responsibility. And I've discussed that, how I think that's working out. She has a concept and understanding of what is his responsibility. She's got a plan where she's going to encourage him to assume that responsibility. She calls Ruth's attention to the fact that Boaz will be spending the night on the threshing floor winnowing barley, and then she instructs Ruth on what to do. And Ruth, very dutifully, she does just what Naomi tells her to do. She bathes, she puts on perfume, she goes to the threshing floor, and she waits until Boaz goes to sleep after finishing his meal, all of which had been laid out, and then she sneaks up to him. She uncovers his feet, maybe even his lower legs, and then she lies down at his feet. All of this is symbolic testimony or a message for him. Boaz is awakened by the cold, as I read it, because of the exposed feet. That's how I take what's going on there. He's awakened by the cold, and when he turns over, he sees this woman lying at his feet, and it's too dark for him to recognize who she is. He asks her who she is, and she identifies herself as Ruth. And then she asks Boaz to marry her because he's a kinsman redeemer. So this is all part of what Naomi is doing. That's the meaning of that statement. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. So this is in Jewish idiom. That's what she's saying to him. Marry me in your role and in your capacity as the near kinsman. I'm asking you to do that. I'm calling on you to fulfill that obligation or that duty. Now the tension, as I mentioned a number of times, the tension at this point in the story, at least as I read it, is whether or not Boaz is going to accept and embrace this broader understanding of the kinsman redeemer's role. Whether he'll go ahead and adopt that. Whether he'll see that, you see, as a proper expression of the clan guardian principle that's inherent in the kinsman redeemer role. Is he going to embrace that and say, yes, that's really what the role means? Or whether he's going to refuse to help, perhaps even get upset at the request, take umbrage and say, what are you trying to, foist on me some kind of duty that I don't owe? So that's the tension and the risk that's involved there. And, is he going to insist on a narrower interpretation of his responsibility under these atypical facts. You see, that's what I think brings in the uncertainty. We have this unusual situation. Is he going to do that? Well, in chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, he reacts very positively. And that's where I want to pick back up. I'll repeat much of what I said right at the end of last class, and then we'll go on. But in chapter 3, verse 10 and 11, it says, "And he said, 'May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You've made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you've not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman.'" So we get the answer. How's he going to react? Is he going to be, whoa, what are you doing? No. He's very positive about the proposal, and rather than chastising her for trying to foist the duty on him he didn't owe, he invokes a blessing on her, and he praises her for taking her devotion to Naomi so far as to seek to marry him for the family's sake. In other words, she's willing to marry him, this older man, for the sake of maintaining Elimelech's line, than to go after one of the young men. Her husband's dead. She could go after somebody else. But rather than do that, she's taking her devotion to Naomi and her family to the next level. He says, this is even greater than the first thing. When you pledged yourself to Naomi, you're willing to marry me. So you're taking it to the next level. Now, I didn't mention last week that it's interesting. He's very humble in this because he portrays himself as a relatively poor catch. He says, well, you could have gone after one of these young bucks. Whether you did it for love or you did it for money, you could have gone after somebody. It's not exactly like, this guy, he is a guy of wealth and status in the society. So it's not like he's chopped liver. But you see the way he presents it here. Now, he tells Ruth in verse 11 not to fear. He's going to do all that she asks. And this raises this prospect that there's more involved here than simply marriage. And it's saying he's going to do it he says he'll do it for all the townspeople know. He says, I'm going to do it for all the townspeople know that she's a worthy woman. And I think what he's doing there, as I said last week, I think he's saying, listen, you don't have to worry. I'm going to go ahead and do this. You don't have to worry that the resistance to me doing this is going to intimidate me so I won't go through with it. Because the resistance that would be generated, that you may be anticipating, would come from the fact you're a Moabite and everybody would be hostile against you and therefore would fly-spec the situation and really try to resist it in every way possible of my marrying you in the capacity of a kinsman redeemer and say, no, that's not right. You can't do this. He says, look, that has all been dispelled. The prejudice against you as a Moabite that you may be fearing would arise and cause hostility. I'm telling you that's not going to intimidate me because it's not going to be an issue because you have dispelled it by the righteousness of your life. Okay, everybody knows you're a worthy woman, Moabite or not. You've already put that matter to rest. Everybody knows that you're a worthy woman. So I think that's what's going on there. Okay, in 12 to 15, the ESV have modified it here and I'll explain this in a second. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said to himself, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you're wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. So verse 12, we have it raises this potential stumbling block to his fulfilling his intention to marry Ruth. He says, look, I'm going to marry you. I'll do all that you can. But then he says, look, there's somebody else that we're going to have to deal with. He acknowledges that he is indeed a kinsman redeemer. He says that now it is true that I am a redeemer. And the implication, if I'm on the right track in reading this, the implication is that he accepts the validity of Ruth's claim and thus her view of his duty. When she says, marry me because you're the kinsman redeemer, he says, you're right, I am the kinsman redeemer. So see, implicit in that is this idea, okay, I'm with you. I agree that I'm a kinsman redeemer, and yes, in all this situation, that this more expansive view, I accept that. that is a correct understanding of the principle of a kinsman redeemer's role to protect the clan. So I think that's implicit when he says that. And then he adds, but there's another kinsman redeemer who's prior to him. You see, prior to him by virtue of being a closer relative to Elimelech. Uh-oh. You see, we have this whole thing working and it's going, and it's just coming together. And he says, yeah, I'm ready to do that. I accept that. I'm ready. But there's somebody closer than I am. And I can't marry you. I can't do any of this because this fella, he's got rights. He's closer, so that has to be something that has to be acknowledged. Now, presumably, Naomi was unaware of this other kinsman redeemer, that he had priority when he sent Ruth to Boaz. I mean, that would be a terrible spot to send her. So I'm assuming that she didn't know about this. You say, well, how could she not know about it? Well, I can imagine ways. It doesn't say, but perhaps the rules for determining priority, perhaps they were complex and they were less well known the further you got out from the immediate circle of the deceased. There's just a lot about this we don't know. So maybe the further you get away, it gets kind of complicated on who's what. Or maybe she didn't remember or didn't know exactly how these people related. Maybe they're distant relatives. And she was thinking, no, this is the guy who would be closer under the applicable principles. But it turns out, no, this guy's, third cousin of Mary, and he's over here, and he comes in. So it's certainly conceivable that she would not know that there was somebody closer than Boaz. And Boaz tells her in verse 13, he tells her to spend the remainder of the night at the threshing floor. And he does that, I think, because the dead of the night, that's no time for a young woman to be out. I mean, we think, well, no, the world was completely different. People are people. And you got a young woman going out in the dead of the night. It's not smart then. It's not smart now. And so he tells her, listen, you go ahead and you stay here for the night. And he also tells her that he'll bring the matter of her redemption. He's going to bring the matter of her redemption to a resolution in the morning. And he assures her with an oath that he will redeem her if the prior kinsman redeemer won't. Okay, she says, I'm going to bring this matter. I'm going to solve this, take care of this. If the guy who's ahead of me in priority, if he won't do it, then I'm telling you with an oath that I'm going to do it. Now, to redeem her, he uses this term redeemer, presumably means not simply to marry her. That's not what it means to redeem her, to marry. It means to marry her in the capacity of a kinsman redeemer. You see, there has to be this legal capacity so that any children that are born to her, that first child would have some kind of legal tie to the deceased and his property. You see, that's why people might want to come in and try to argue about that. So he says, I will redeem you, and it means I will marry you in the capacity of a kinsman redeemer so that a child that we have will have this connection to the deceased and his property. As indicated in chapter 4, redemption by the kinsman redeemer, it includes a transaction of some kind involving Elimelech's property. I'm going to talk about that. That's just one of the murkier things you get when you're trying to figure out what is going on here. We're looking at family law and customs from 3,000 years ago. And it's not easy to try to sort out and say exactly what is going on. We don't have the statutes. You sit here and you have the Old Testament. We have levirate marriage. We have kinsman redeemer. We don't see them being fused except here. And then when you have this atypical situation, you have to say, well, how does this play out? And so here, when we get to her, the property, and what is Naomi's interest in it and all that, it gets complicated. But I'll chop through it and tell you how I see it. Now, Boaz's integrity is evident here, isn't it? Right? I mean, he wants to marry Ruth, but rather than violate protocol, rather than say, okay, let's go ahead and let's do this and just ice this guy out. See, rather than act improperly, he is willing to say, no, there's somebody ahead of me. So we're going to let that guy have his opportunity, and then we'll just trust God for the result. I'm not going to cut corners. I'm not going to cheat because I say this is what I want and this is the way I got to get. No, we're going to play it straight up. We'll play it straight up, and then we'll trust God for how it works out. And so you see his integrity. It shows through right there. Well, Ruth awakens before there's enough light to recognize anybody. Okay, so it's still dark. Now, presumably she's concerned, she does that because she's concerned about how it would appear for her to be seen leaving the threshing floor. You can imagine how it would appear. If people see her, she's been spending the night down there, what are people going to think? Well, they're going to think she's been down there having sex with people. And so that's no good. And all the talking in the world won't dispel that. No, that's not what I was doing. You see, that word gets out. And so she's up probably thinking about it. Now, Boaz, he was thinking the same thing. Now, if you see here, I said this is modified. Down at the end of verse 14, it says, he said. It literally simply says, he said. Okay, but it looks like what it means is he said to himself in the sense of he thought. All right, now you say, well, is that legit? Yeah, there are times when that just say he said clearly means he's speaking to himself. He's thinking. And so you say he said to himself, that makes more sense. And in fact, I think it's Hubbard and Frederick Bush and the New English translation opt for this and recognize this, that he said to himself. And that makes sense because the way it reads, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Well, that would be an odd way to speak to Ruth, wouldn't it? You would say, let it not be known that you came to the threshing floor. And so the fact it says, let it not be known that the woman, third person, it makes it seem like he said to himself, he's thinking this. Same thing she's thinking, apparently, that, listen, this better not get out because this will complicate things. It'll also make you look bad. So he's thinking the same thing. She's apparently thinking that. And then he loads her up with 6 measures of barley grain. Now this is a ton of stuff. Probably, it just says measures. It probably means 6 seahs, which would weigh somewhere between 58 and 95 pounds. Okay, so we're talking about a ton of stuff. Right? I mean, I wonder about that, but you've seen these pictures of women, typically in other cultures, carrying a ton of stuff. I said that would throw me in a trash can to have to lug that around. But apparently, these are some strong women. So 60 pounds of stuff, she says, all right, you throw it on me and I'll take it. Gladly. But he loads her up with these 6 measures and she returns to the town, or it says he returns to the town. There's a textual issue of what was originally written. Okay, does it say she returns or does it say he returns? Probably says she returns, that makes sense, but there's at least an issue there. All right, 3:16 says, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Well, she's interested, right? I mean, this is her plan. She sent Ruth there, and she's very curious what went on. She said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. So here we have, when Ruth returns, Naomi naturally wants to know, all right, how'd it go? We've got this plan in motion. And she tells Naomi all that Boaz about what he did for her. She fills her in, says, this is how it went down. I said this, he said that, and this is what he said. And he generously, he provided me this huge load of grain, just to let you know how positive he's feeling about everything. Okay, it's not like he was at least a bit upset or no, he's on board. This is, it's a done, he's there with us. And he gives me this huge load of grain. And she adds that Boaz said when giving me the grain, he said that I couldn't go back to you empty-handed. Now, I don't know if this is reading too much into it, but if you remember in chapter 1, verse 21, what had Naomi said? She said that she had left full and she had come back empty. You see, she had come back empty. And now we have Boaz saying to Ruth, you can't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. And I see in this, you see this idea. I'm thinking when Naomi hears this, is this another sign from God saying to her, I'm working. Do you see? I'm working. I'm reversing your emptiness. I am changing this dark hole you were in with all of this terrible situation. I'm working. I'm working through Ruth clinging to you. I'm working through these circumstances where you just happen to see Boaz. I'm working from in this plan, Boaz's positive reception. Hear me. Listen to me. See that I'm working. And sometimes God gives us those kinds of things to just let you know I'm there. You see? Don't you? I know the storm of this world, sometimes it's easy to forget that I'm really there. And He'll drop these things and let you know. All right? You understand, right? I'm there. Even when it looks like I'm not. I'm there working. And so here, I just think that was, there's something about that I think the writer is signaling something now. Okay? Now, he's not finished. God's not finished filling her cup. Naomi tells Ruth to wait to see things how they're going to play out. She's convinced that Boaz, he's going to pursue this matter to conclusion that day. He's not going to rest. He's not going to sleep on it, just to stall. This guy's going to go ahead and he's going to bring this matter to a head. And so now, as a reader, you're left in suspense. All right, what's going to happen? Because here we have this wonderful God at work, this providence. We have this plan that was done. We have the positive reception, everything. And then we got this fly in the ointment. We have this guy who's up here in front, and he's going to ruin everything. He's going to wind up saying, no, okay, I'm good. I'm taking it. I'm going to redeem her. And then this whole thing with Boaz, that's all just thrown away. So there's a sense here of, all right, what's going to happen? Chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. It says, now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, you see, behold, he sits at the gate, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken, he came by. You see? He just happened to come by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Now Boaz, he goes to the city gate that morning because the city gate is something like a little town square. You see, this was the happening place. You have the gate that's in and out of the city, and there's this alcove that's attached to it. And people could sit there, and this is where they typically conducted business. The woman in Proverbs 31, what's her husband doing? Well, he's hanging out at the city gate. Well, that's why. The city gate is a place where, the elders would gather oftentimes. This is where business would be conducted. So that's what's behind that. Now, the other kinsman redeemer, Boaz had mentioned, he just happened to come by. It wasn't like he was already out in the field and you'd have to wait and couldn't see him that day to conduct business. It was just very, just the timing was just wonderful. He goes there and this fellow happens to come by, and Boaz calls him over and says, hey, coming over here, we got to talk. Now, the author doesn't reveal this guy's identity. Okay, he tells us all these other characters, but doesn't reveal this person's identity. He instead refers to him in the second part of verse 1 with a Hebrew wordplay that means something like Mr. So-and-so. Okay, in fact, that's how it's translated, and I think the New Jewish Publication Society's version, Mr. So-and-so. But he leaves this person anonymous. Most English translations, they capture the anonymity by simply referring to him as friend. But that's not really what the word is saying. As Daniel Block says, the rendering Mr. So-and-so found in the New Jewish Publication Society version certainly captures the sense better than the NIV's my friend, but our hey you works in the present context. So there's something about just this person is anonymous. And I think there's a reason that it left that way. Perhaps the author is keeping this person anonymous because he acts selfishly in comparison to Boaz, as we'll see. He doesn't mention this person. The writer of the story, this person is not particularly worthy of mention. Certainly his identity is not necessary for the story. But in any event, the person's not identified. All right, so Boaz sees this guy. He says, hey, come on over here. He's got to do some business. And then he gathers together 10 of the city's elders. These are men who are part of the community's local governing body. He finds 10 elders. Apparently 10 was a sufficient number to serve as witnesses for the kind of transaction that he has in mind. So here's the guy he's got to do business with, the prior kinsman redeemer, grabs him, and then he goes and grabs 10 elders and sit down. So we're going to do some business. Okay, we got to solve this thing, how this is going to play out. So here they are. They sit at the gate. And then chapter 4, verse 3 through 8, it says, then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel. I'm going to say a bit about selling. When we hear selling, you think one thing. You might prefer disposing. But anyway, I'll torture with that in a second. Is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there's no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. All right, in verse 3, Boaz tells this other Redeemer that Naomi is selling the field of Elimelech, their mutual relative. Now this is the first mention that we have of any family land. They are probably aware of it as tied in with the whole thing with Ruth. But this is the first time we hear of any mention of it. And it's difficult, if not impossible, to be confident of what's going on here. Okay, this is where this distance and what are the rules and what's happening really become hard to grapple with and to be sure about something. Oh, very difficult here. It seems clear that, look, Naomi has some kind of interest in Elimelech's field that is of no practical value to her in terms of easing her difficult circumstances. I mean, the whole thing has been about what a bust it is for her, how she's left with nothing, how they're out scrounging. What are they doing? They're scavenging for food. They're gleaning. They're like beggars out trying to... Well, all right, so she has some kind of interest, but it's of no use to her in alleviating her situation. So that much seems clear. Okay, but what is the nature then of that interest? She's got some kind of interest, but what is it? How can it be an interest that does nothing to alleviate her circumstances? What is going on? Okay, what I think is happening, it's impossible, it's possible. Okay, possible, perhaps even likely, that prior to being driven to Moab by the famine, prior to being driven to Moab, that Elimelech had been pressured to sell his field to somebody outside of the clan. All right, so you can see that if the economic circumstances were so dire that there were no available clan members who could stall that sale, he's ready to sell it to a non-clan member, and there's nobody in the clan who can say, no, I will give it to you. I will stop the sale. I will buy it. I will give you the money. So he wound up out of economic necessity having to sell the plot or the field to somebody who wasn't a family member. Now, when I say sell to somebody who wasn't a clan member, all right, well, the right to possess, what he's doing, he's simply selling the right to possess and use the property until the year of Jubilee. Because when you sell something to somebody who's not a clan member, you cannot sell it in some kind of absolute sense. You can only do that to a clan member. If you sell it outside, to somebody outside the clan, well then a kinsman redeemer is to bring it back into the clan, but if that doesn't happen, at the year of Jubilee, every 50th year, that property comes back to the clan. Okay, so you're not selling it in the sense we say when you buy something, I own it in fee simple. I own it outright. That's not what's happening here. He would have sold to somebody the right to use that property until the year of Jubilee. He did it because of the economic circumstances. I just speculate. This makes sense. That he wound up, he would do it because the famine had become so difficult. He first sells the field. Here's what Daniel Block, he says, it seems most reasonable that moving to Moab had been a last resort for Elimelech. Before he would embark on such a drastic course of action, he would have attempted every other alternative, including selling the land to an outsider. Obviously, the poverty continued, and after the money from the sale was used up, he seems to have been faced with two choices: sell himself into slavery or move to a place where food was available. And moving to Moab, he chose the lesser of two evils. I mean, this makes sense to me. That somebody, because we know he was driven to Moab, And I could see somebody, and when you read something like this, you just think of what a different world it was, right? You say, how could it ever be so bad that well, it can get that bad. This is life and death. And so this guy said, look, I got to sell this field. And I'm sure there were people over there under those circumstances. Sure, I'm very happy to buy your field at a nice price. You see, because, oh, you have to sell, do you? Oh, what, starving? Okay. I'll give you some money for that field. And then apparently it wasn't enough, and then they wind up still going to Moab. Now it seems that Naomi is Elimelech's widow. Okay, now this is where Elimelech's widow, she inherited from him. This is putting many things together and trying to understand this, because the widow doesn't inherit the property. Okay? The widow doesn't inherit an ownership in the property, but she obviously has some interest in Elimelech's property. Okay, that is not any good to her in terms of alleviating her circumstances. What's going on? It seems that she inherited from him a right to possess and use the property until she married again or died. Okay, so when he dies, she doesn't own the property, but she does get a right to use the property and to possess the property until either she dies or marries again, at which time that interest, possessory interest, the right to possess and use it, would revert to the husband's clan in the normal order of inheritance. Okay, so she wouldn't have inherited the property itself, only this temporary interest in it. Otherwise, if she inherits the property, and there's nothing in the Old Testament that says that a white widow inherits the property, but if she had inherited the property, then when she married, if she did remarry somebody outside the clan, then it would have gone out. Okay, so she has some interest. It is not an ownership interest, but she's got some interest in this property. Now, since her inherited right, she has this right to possess and to use the property until she dies or remarries, since that presumably had already been what? Transferred. Right? When Elimelech went to Moab, if we're reconstructing this right, and I understand it doesn't say any of this. I'm trying to make sense of what is going on. So if we're right, if Elimelech, if that's what he sold, what did he sell? He can't sell the ownership to a non-clan member. He can only sell the right to possess and use the property, which would then revert to them at Jubilee. So what has happened is the right she inherited is of no use to her because it's already been sold to somebody else. Now, she could redeem it from that person. She would have a prior interest and say, okay, I can get my right. So this guy says, I'm not going to give you back that right. I'm not going to sell it. I'm happy here. I like the field. I like the way everything is going. She apparently has a right to say, no, I'm the widow and I received this right. And yes, you had it, but I can make you give it back to me. But she's not in a position to do that. She's poverty stricken. Now when Boaz tells this other redeemer that Naomi is, quote, selling the field of Elimelech, what I think he's saying is that he probably means, it would have been understood to mean, that she was transferring or disposing of her right to buy back the field from the current possessor. She has priority over him and she can get it back from him. He can't say, I'm not going to give it back to you. So I think instead of what we think of as sale, it's not a sale. She has a prior right of redemption that she can get from her, but she's penniless. And so she's not selling the land itself. What she's doing is she's transferring her right, her priority to get this thing back from this person. Now, Frederick Bush, he translates this relevant part of verse 3. He says, Naomi is hereby surrendering her right to the field of our brother Elimelech. See, instead of selling, transferring, surrendering the right to. In other words, taking her right, her prior interest of possession that she has, that she can call in from this guy to whom Elimelech has sold the property before going to Moab. She has that right and she's going to transfer that. She's ready now to give that up and give that to somebody who can do something with it because she can't do anything with it. And so she's there now, she's in that position. She's passing her right of redemption to Elimelech's nearest kinsman redeemer, which he presumably has to exercise then. So she says, okay, I've got this thing, I'm starving, I can't do anything with it, I'm passing this to you, and then when you get this, you are obligated to exercise. You don't just get the right and sit on it, especially when there's somebody behind you who's saying, I want to exercise it. So she's getting ready to pass this on. Now, here we go, Bush. Boaz in verse 4, he tells the other kinsman redeemer, He tells this person to acquire the right of redemption that Naomi is surrendering. Okay, so I said this thing about selling and buying, I think, throws us off because it doesn't make any sense to say, well, she owns a field and she's out begging and scrounging. She doesn't own a field. If she owned a field, she wouldn't be poverty-stricken, and the whole story doesn't make sense. Okay, so here's what Bush says. It does not seem beyond the range of probability at all that in the context of a widow's right of usufruct, all right. This is what I'm talking about the right to possess and use as opposed to own. Okay, so he says that the widow's right of usufruct of her husband's estate, all right, it does not seem beyond the range of probability at all that in the context of a widow's right of usufruct of her husband's estate, these verbs, sell and buy, have shed their component of compensation and mean dispose of, surrender the rights to, and acquire, accept the rights to, with the context making clear what rights are meant. Okay, so you see, I don't know if I'm getting this across, but what I think is that what she has is an interest as the widow to possess and use the property until she dies or remarries. But that had already been sold out of economic necessity. So now what that right means is she has a right to get this person to give her that, but she has to redeem it and has no money to do so. So what she is going to do now, she's going to transfer this right to the kinsman redeemer. That's what she's saying. I'm transferring this right. Who's going to pick it up? She comes to this dude, and the question is, are you going to pick it up or not? Will you pick up that right and, in fact, then redeem the property? When you say yes to that, you not only get the right, you must exercise it and redeem the property. And go to this third person to whom Elimelech had transferred that right, that right of possession, that right of use, and you say, okay, let's talk turkey. I'm going to pay you so much money, and this baby's coming back over here. Okay, and then Naomi's going to have it. So that's what's being sold, because there is no redemption discussion here with the third party. Okay, they're not talking about that. At least it seems to me they're not talking about that. Now, acquiring the right, I heard that bell go off in a second. But acquiring the right apparently carries the duty, as I said, of exercising it. Guy can't get the right under these circumstances, say, okay, I got it and I'll just hold it for the future. He has to exercise it. So Boaz tells him to say whether or not he's going to redeem the property. Are you going to go for it or not? Because if you're not going to redeem the property, then I'm telling you that I'm going to redeem it. Okay, now you see that the actual redemption of the property from the third person, that's not reported anywhere. We're not talking about the redemption itself. We're talking about a transfer of this right and this obligation to go ahead and redeem the property. In Bush's words, he says the actual redemption of the property from the third person, he says it takes place off stage. And you say, well, why isn't all this spelled out? Because the person who was reading this in antiquity, one of these people, they would know all this. You and I are looking at it from a long way away, and we're scratching our heads going, what's going on? I'm trying to reconstruct something that I think makes sense of the whole storyline and all this going on. But like I said, it's difficult, if not impossible, to be confident about these kinds of things, okay? Now, the near Redeemer, he says he's going to redeem the property. Now, all the air goes out of the room in that. We got this whole thing up, and he says, I got this thing, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Hey, are you going to redeem the property? Yeah, I'm going to redeem it. What are you talking about? You're going to redeem it. Wait, what? What's all the stuff with Boaz and Ruth and all of this? What's all that going on? We'll find out next week. Thanks.